Millionaire believed he was forced to wed an unattractive bride, but what he discovered left him stunned. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. The rain lashed against the tall windows of the Parker estate, streaking silver across the glass. Inside the grand dining hall, the long mahogany table stretched like a runway between two generations of power. At one end sat Alexander Parker, a 32-year-old tech millionaire whose name alone moved markets. His jaw was tight, his gaze fixed on the untouched crystal glass in front of him. Across from him, his father's voice echoed, calm but heavy with command. "You want full control of the company, Alex? Then you will marry her." The room fell silent except for the crackle of the fireplace. A dozen board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Alex lifted his eyes slowly, disbelief burning behind them. "You cannot be serious. An arranged marriage? In this century?" But the papers were already on the table. The contract was real. The inheritance clause was ironclad, and standing near the corner, trying to blend into the wallpaper, was the bride his family had chosen. Her name was Clara Bennett, 26 years old. She wore a modest dress that looked borrowed, her dark hair pinned back in a plain bun. No diamonds, no gloss, no air of privilege. Her posture was tense, her eyes lowered, as though she had already accepted her role as a pawn in someone else's game. To Alex, she seemed painfully ordinary. Worse, he felt mocked by the contrast between his empire and this timid girl who did not even look him in the eye. He leaned back in his chair, bitterness curling his lips. "You expect me to marry her? To stand beside her in front of the world?" His father's gaze was cold steel. "If you refuse, the board will interpret it as weakness. The shares will slip away. You could lose the very company you built." Clara's fingers twisted together at her waist, pale knuckles showing. She had reasons of her own to agree. A mountain of debt, a mother bedridden with hospital bills, and a family farm about to be repossessed. This marriage was her only chance to keep her family from losing everything. "I do not need her," Alex snapped, his voice low but sharp. "And I do not need this farce." But then came the detail that cornered him completely. The contract had been signed by his late grandfather years ago, a hidden clause that stated, "The heir must marry by the age of 33 or relinquish all executive power." Alex was days away from that birthday. The air thickened. Clara raised her eyes for the first time, and for a flicker of a moment, Alex saw not weakness but quiet resolve. Still, to him she remained an obstacle, an inconvenience wrapped in plain fabric. The lawyer cleared his throat. "The ceremony can be arranged within the week. We only need your signature, Mr. Parker." Alex's pen hovered above the page. The room seemed to hold its breath. He looked once more at the young woman across from him. She did not smile. She did not plead. She simply stood still, bracing herself for whatever storm was coming. The tip of the pen touched paper, and with that single stroke, Alexander Parker, the proud millionaire who had sworn never to let anyone dictate his life, found himself bound to a stranger he had already judged as unworthy. What he did not know was that the plain young woman beside him was about to unravel every certainty he held, and the truth waiting behind her quiet eyes would leave him stunned. Alexander Parker did not sleep that night. The storm outside his penthouse windows had calmed, but inside his mind, the storm only grew louder. The ink of his reluctant signature still haunted him. He had agreed to marry Clara Bennett, a woman he barely knew and already dismissed. Every instinct in him rebelled, yet the clause in his grandfather's will had cornered him with merciless precision. Without this marriage, the company he built from sleepless nights and ruthless decisions would be taken away in days. He stood before the glass wall of his living room. The skyline of New York stretched endlessly, glittering like shards of glass. It was everything he had fought for: the empire, the recognition, the power. And now all of it was balanced on a single marriage contract with a woman he had judged as ordinary, even unworthy. Across town, Clara sat at the edge of her narrow bed in a one-bedroom apartment that smelled faintly of damp plaster. The ticking of a cheap wall clock filled the silence. Her mother slept in the adjoining room, frail from months of hospital stays, breathing shallow beneath a pile of blankets. Clara's eyes lingered on a stack of unpaid bills on the small kitchen counter. Rent, medical fees, pharmacy receipts. She pressed her palms into her lap, trying to steady herself. The marriage was not a dream, not even a choice. It was survival. Her father had died years ago, leaving behind debt that grew like weeds. Since then, Clara had worked long shifts at a local bookstore, skipped meals to stretch her paycheck, and sold the few pieces of jewelry her mother once cherished. But still, it was never enough. When the Parker family proposal came, it had felt like a trap and a lifeline at once. She would carry the humiliation if it meant her mother would live without fear of eviction or hospitals refusing care. Meanwhile, Alexander walked into his office the next morning, his assistant Claire waiting with a file in her hands. "Your schedule for today, Mr. Parker," she said carefully, watching him with concern. His eyes were shadowed from lack of rest. "Cancel the lunch with the investors," he ordered, his voice clipped. "I am not in the mood to parade myself." Claire hesitated before speaking. "The board expects to see you alongside Miss Bennett soon. They want reassurance that this arrangement is real." At the sound of her name, Alexander's jaw clenched. "Do not remind me," he muttered. But inside, a hollow unease gnawed at him. He had always controlled every deal, every partnership, every merger. But this felt like surrender. Clara, too, prepared for the reality she could not escape. She walked through the small neighborhood market later that afternoon, her coat pulled tight against the wind. Neighbors whispered when they saw her. News of her engagement had already spread, distorted into gossip. "She is marrying the Parker millionaire," one voice said. "Imagine that plain girl becoming Mrs. Parker," another chuckled. Clara kept her head down, clutching a grocery bag of vegetables she could barely afford. Shame pressed heavy, but beneath it was a thin thread of determination. At dusk, the two worlds prepared to collide again. Clara folded her only decent dress into a thrift store suitcase, the hem neatly sewn by her own hands. Alexander adjusted his cufflinks in front of a mirror that reflected nothing but cold perfection. Two lives separated by wealth and pride, bound by a contract neither had wanted. For Alexander, the stakes were power, legacy, and the fear of losing everything he built. For Clara, the stakes were survival, dignity, and the life of her mother. Both stood on the edge of a choice they had already made but had yet to truly live. And though Alexander believed he had married only out of obligation, and though Clara believed she had sacrificed her freedom for her mother's health, the truth waiting between them was something neither of them could imagine. The contract was only the beginning. The day of the legal signing arrived faster than either of them wanted. A gray sky loomed over Manhattan, clouds pressing low as if even the heavens disapproved. Inside the Parker law office, the conference room gleamed with polished marble floors and walls lined with shelves of leather-bound volumes. A long oak table dominated the space, and on it lay the thin folder that contained the agreement which would dictate their lives. Alexander Parker entered first, his presence commanding the room even in silence. He wore a tailored suit, every line sharp, every detail immaculate. Yet his face carried the weight of resentment, his jaw set tight, his eyes unreadable. He did not glance toward Clara when she was led in moments later by a junior associate. She wore a simple navy dress, modest and practical, her hands folded in front of her. Compared to the room's glossy luxury, she seemed small, almost out of place, but her gaze held a quiet steadiness that belied her unease. The lawyer cleared his throat. "This is a standard marital contract with additional stipulations agreed upon by both families." His tone was dry, practiced. He slid copies of the document toward them. Clara lowered her eyes to the printed words. The clauses were cold, stripped of romance, more business deal than vow. She read them carefully, her lips pressed tight. Alexander leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "State them," he ordered. The lawyer nodded. Clause 1. The marriage is to be presented as legitimate in public for a minimum period of 12 months. Clause 2. Both parties agree to attend designated social and corporate events together as a couple. Clause 3. There will be no expectation of intimacy or interference in each other's private affairs. Clause 4. Confidentiality must be maintained regarding the contractual nature of this marriage. Any breach will result in severe penalties. Clara's throat tightened at those words. She glanced at Alexander, but he remained motionless, his face a mask. The lawyer added, "There is also an additional stipulation requested by Mr. Parker. Neither party may interfere with the other's business or personal financial matters. Independence is to be respected." Finally, Alexander spoke, his tone cold but precise. "And let us add one more. There will be no false expectations. This is a contract, nothing more. Do you understand?" The words cut like a blade, but Clara lifted her chin slightly. "I understand," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. The lawyer placed pens before them. Clara's fingers trembled as she lifted hers. For a moment, she thought of her mother sleeping peacefully, unaware of the weight of this arrangement. She thought of the bills waiting at home, the eviction notice she had hidden in her dresser drawer. With a deep breath, she pressed the pen to paper and signed her name. Alexander followed, his movement brisk, almost careless. He signed without hesitation, as though eager to end the charade. The sound of the pen scratching across the page sealed the agreement. The lawyer gathered the documents, his expression neutral. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Parker. The contract is now binding." The words hung in the air like a sentence handed down in court. Clara's heart pounded, not from joy but from the finality of it. Alexander rose first, adjusting his cufflinks with mechanical precision. Without looking at her, he said, "You will be informed of the schedule of appearances. Follow it. And this year will pass quickly." Clara stood slowly, her suitcase by her side, the thrift store fabric worn but neatly folded. She gave a small nod, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of seeing her hurt. As they walked out of the law office together, the city roared around them with taxis honking and pedestrians rushing by, oblivious to the contract that had just been signed. Two strangers, now bound as husband and wife, not by love but by ink and necessity. Alexander stepped into the waiting car without offering her a hand. Clara followed, sitting across from him in the spacious back seat. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the hum of the engine and the rhythm of rain against the windows. For him, this was nothing more than a transaction. For her, it was both salvation and a sentence. Neither spoke, but both felt the weight of what had just begun. In that moment, beneath the gray sky of New York, a millionaire and a plain young woman embarked on a marriage that was not meant to be real. Yet fate had a way of twisting contracts into destinies, and neither of them knew just how much this arrangement would change their lives forever. The cab carrying Alexander Parker and Clara Bennett rolled through the iron gates of the Parker estate. The driveway stretched like a river of stone toward a mansion that seemed more museum than home. Towering columns framed the entrance, and the windows glowed with golden light, though they radiated little warmth. Clara pressed her fingers into her lap as the car slowed to a halt. She had never stepped foot into a place so enormous, so intimidating, and now it was meant to be her home. The butler opened the door with a bow. Alexander stepped out first, his expression unreadable, and strode up the marble steps without glancing back. Clara gathered her thrift store suitcase, her shoes clicking faintly against the stone. The front doors opened into a grand foyer with a chandelier that cascaded like frozen rain, catching light from the high-arched windows. Every surface gleamed, but the air felt cold, untouched by life. "Welcome, Mrs. Parker," the butler said politely. Clara forced a small nod, but the title felt strange, heavy, almost mocking. Alexander's voice cut through the silence. "Your room is down the East Hall. Dinner is served at 7. Do not be late." His tone was clipped, professional, as though she were an employee rather than his wife. Without another word, he turned and disappeared up the staircase, his polished shoes echoing against the marble. A housekeeper guided Clara to her quarters. The room was luxurious beyond anything she had imagined. A king-sized bed with silk sheets, antique furniture polished to perfection, and windows that overlooked manicured gardens. Yet despite its beauty, the space felt sterile, lifeless, like a hotel room waiting for a guest who never intended to stay. Clara placed her small suitcase on the edge of the massive bed, its worn fabric looking pitiful against the silk coverlet. She smoothed the hem of her dress and whispered to herself, 1 year, just 1 year. When the clock chimed 7, Clara made her way to the dining hall. The table was so long she could hardly see the other end clearly. Candles flickered in crystal holders, and plates of fine cuisine had already been set by unseen hands. Alexander sat at the far end, dressed in a dark suit, his posture straight and formal. He glanced up briefly as she entered, then returned to cutting his food with surgical precision. Clara took her seat at the opposite end. The silence stretched, filled only by the faint clink of silverware. She reached for her fork, her hand trembling slightly. It was not nerves alone. It was the weight of being treated as invisible. After several minutes, she spoke, her voice soft. "This place is beautiful, but it feels so empty." Alexander did not look up. "It is a house, not a home. Do not expect warmth here." His words stung, but Clara pressed on. "Why agree to live like this? Even if it is only for a year, it could be easier if we—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "If we tried to treat each other with respect." This time he raised his eyes, cold and sharp. "Respect is earned, Clara. And as far as I am concerned, this marriage is nothing more than a contract. Do not ask for more." Her cheeks burned, but she bit back the retort that rose in her throat. Instead, she lowered her gaze to the plate before her, the food tasting of nothing as she forced herself to swallow. Later that night, Clara wandered quietly through the east wing, the soft glow of lamps guiding her steps. She paused before a painting on the wall, a portrait of Alexander's late mother. The woman's eyes were kind, gentle, a stark contrast to the man her son had become. Clara whispered softly, "What happened to him?" Unbeknownst to her, Alexander stood at the top of the stairs, watching her silhouette in the dim light. His face softened for a fleeting second, a shadow of the boy he once was, but the moment vanished as quickly as it appeared. He turned away, locking his emotions behind steel once more. For Clara, the mansion felt like a cage, each hallway echoing with silence. For Alexander, it was a fortress built to keep pain at bay. Both of them were trapped, bound by signatures on paper. Yet beneath the cold distance, something subtle had begun to shift. Neither realized that the very contract meant to separate their hearts would soon be the force that pushed them together, in ways neither could predict. The year had only just begun. The first public test of their arranged marriage came sooner than Clara expected. Barely a week had passed since she had moved into the Parker estate when Alexander's assistant arrived at her door with a sleek black folder. Inside was an invitation embossed in silver, the kind that smelled of wealth and scrutiny. A charity gala hosted by the Parker Foundation. Attendance mandatory. That evening, the mansion's grand staircase felt more like a runway of judgment. Clara descended carefully, wearing the gown chosen by Alexander's stylist. It was a pale blue dress, elegant but understated, designed not to draw attention. Yet when she entered the car beside him, she felt the weight of his silence press harder than any gaze. The gala was held at a hotel ballroom shimmering with chandeliers. Reporters and socialites clustered near the entrance, their cameras flashing like lightning. Alexander stepped out first, his expression carved from stone. When Clara followed, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some smiled politely, others whispered behind their champagne glasses. She heard it clearly, words about her plain looks, her modest background, her being unfit to stand beside a millionaire. Alexander offered his arm out of duty. Clara took it, her spine straightening even as her stomach churned. They walked into the ballroom together, the picture of a couple, though the distance between them felt vast. Inside, introductions began. A senior board member approached, his smile thin as paper. "Mr. Parker," he said warmly, then turned his eyes on Clara. "And this must be your bride." His pause lingered too long, his tone polite but laced with disdain. What a surprising choice. Clara's cheeks heated, but before Alexander could cut the moment short, another guest, a glamorous woman draped in diamonds, leaned closer. "Tell us, Mrs. Parker," she said sweetly, "how does it feel to step from a bookstore into a ballroom?" A few guests chuckled under their breath. For a heartbeat, Clara wanted to shrink, to disappear into the glittering floor. But then she remembered her mother's voice, urging her never to let shame silence her. She lifted her chin. "It feels," she said clearly, her voice carrying just enough, "like books prepared me better than you might imagine. In literature, we learn how pride can blind, how vanity can destroy, and how kindness is the only measure of true worth. I may not wear diamonds, but I do not need them to recognize the difference." The air shifted. A few gasps broke the silence. Even the woman in diamonds faltered, her painted smile stiffening. Then, unexpectedly, applause rose from a corner table, followed by murmurs of approval. The insult had turned into Clara's quiet triumph. Alexander watched her, his brows drawn together. He had expected her to falter, to hide behind his shadow. Instead, she had faced the wolves with words sharper than any jewel. For the first time, his gaze lingered on her, not with disdain but with curiosity. Later in the evening, when they stood briefly alone near the balcony, Alexander spoke at last. "You handled yourself well." Clara turned her head toward the city lights glittering beyond the glass. "I have had practice," she said softly. "When you grow up being underestimated, you either learn to endure it or you learn to speak." His lips twitched, not quite a smile but not entirely cold either. He found himself wanting to ask more, but the habit of distance held him back. "Do not expect compliments," he said instead, though his voice lacked the edge it once carried. Clara met his eyes, unflinching. "I never asked for them." The evening ended with their picture splashed across every social outlet. To the world, they looked united. To the board, Clara's composure added legitimacy to the marriage. And to Alexander, something new unsettled him. He had married out of obligation, but the woman beside him was proving to be far more than the plain pawn he had assumed. For Clara, the night was a reminder that dignity did not come from jewels or titles. It came from standing firm when others tried to cut you down. And though she returned to the silent mansion with the same modest suitcase in her room, something had shifted in the air between them. The contract had not changed, but perhaps, just perhaps, the people inside it had begun to. The days following the gala moved with a strange new rhythm inside the Parker estate. Clara no longer felt entirely invisible. The whispers of the city still stung, but she had faced them and walked away standing tall. For the first time, Alexander Parker looked at her differently, as though he was not quite sure what to make of the woman who stood at his side. One evening, a week later, Clara found herself wandering through the mansion's private library. The room stretched with shelves of leather-bound books, ladders sliding on rails, and the scent of old paper mixing with polished wood. She traced her fingers along the spines until she stopped at a small volume of poetry. The quiet wrapped around her like a blanket, safer than the ballroom, warmer than the dining table that had felt like a battlefield. Behind her, a low voice spoke. "You actually read them." She startled, nearly dropping the book, before turning to see Alexander leaning against the doorway. He was not in a suit tonight, but in a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled back. It was the first time she had seen him without the armor of wealth. "Of course I read them," Clara replied carefully. "Books do not care about money or contracts. They speak to everyone the same." Alexander stepped into the room, his gaze roaming over the shelves. "My mother used to sit here," he said, almost to himself. "She would read to me when I was a boy. This was her favorite room." His voice softened on the last words, as though memory had cracked through the steel in him. Clara closed the book gently. "She must have been kind," she said. He hesitated before nodding. She was. When she passed, this house became empty. My father filled it with rules, with expectations, but never with warmth. For the first time, Clara saw the weight he carried, not as arrogance but as armor. She stepped closer, her voice low. "That emptiness, it explains why you keep everyone at a distance, even me." Alexander looked at her then, truly looked at her. The walls in his eyes flickered. "Do not mistake honesty for an invitation," he said. But the words lacked the bite they once held. Later that night, Clara stood on the balcony outside her room. The city skyline shimmered, endless and untouchable. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, the cool air brushing her face. To her surprise, Alexander joined her, carrying 2 cups of tea. He handed one to her without a word. "Thank you," she murmured. They stood in silence, the steam curling between them. After a long pause, Alexander spoke again. "You did not break at the gala. You stood taller than half the people in that room. I underestimated you." Clara sipped her tea, her hands warming against the porcelain. Most people do. Something shifted then. The silence between them no longer felt suffocating but tentative, like a bridge being built plank by plank. Alexander leaned on the railing, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. "I have spent years building walls to protect everything I own. Perhaps I forgot that walls also keep out the very things we need. Clara turned to him, startled by the vulnerability in his tone. She wanted to respond, but words tangled in her throat. Instead, she simply met his gaze, and for a moment, the contract between them seemed smaller, less defining. The night stretched quietly. When Alexander finally excused himself, Clara remained on the balcony, her heart unsettled. The man she had thought was nothing more than cold steel carried scars of his own. And beneath the rigid rules of their marriage, something fragile but undeniable had begun to grow. Neither of them admitted it yet, but both knew the truth. This arrangement was no longer just about survival or control. It was about two broken worlds, slowly, cautiously, learning how to meet in the middle. Trouble arrived not with thunder, but with whispers. It began as small columns in business papers, questioning the Parker marriage. The headlines hinted at scandal. Was the CEO forced into an arranged union? And plain bride, hidden motive? Alexander ignored them at first, but the murmurs grew louder. Board members began to ask questions. Investors demanded reassurance. And then, someone fed the press with photographs. Clara leaving a grocery store in her old neighborhood, her modest coat pulled tightly around her, the image captioned, "Millionaire's wife or opportunist in disguise." No. Clara saw the article the next morning while sipping tea in the silent kitchen. Her hands trembled as the words blurred before her eyes. She had agreed to humiliation when she signed the contract, but this was different. This was character assassination, painted for the world to devour. Alexander stormed into the room minutes later, the newspaper crumpled in his fist. "Did you speak to them?" His tone was sharp, accusatory. "No," Clara answered firmly, though her voice shook. "I would never," but doubt flashed in his eyes. Convenient, is it not? The poor girl turned millionaire's wife suddenly has the entire city's attention. Perhaps this was your plan all along. Her chest tightened. "You truly believe that of me?" He did not answer. He simply tossed the paper on the table and walked away, his silence cutting deeper than words. That evening, Clara remained in her room, her suitcase still sitting by the wardrobe like a reminder of how temporary her presence was. She whispered to herself, 1 year, just 1 year, but even the words sounded hollow now. Unseen by them both, the true hand behind the scandal smiled. It was Victoria Hayes, Alexander's former fiancée, the glamorous woman in diamonds who had mocked Clara at the gala. She had fed the tabloids, twisting Clara's past into a weapon, hoping to fracture the fragile marriage. With every headline, her plan inched closer to success. The next board meeting was a battlefield. Shareholders murmured about annulment, about reputation. One man even said aloud, "Perhaps Mr. Parker should reconsider his choice. A scandal of this size cannot be ignored." Alexander sat stiffly, fury boiling under his composed surface. When asked to defend his marriage, his eyes flicked to the empty chair where Clara should have been. She had refused to attend, unwilling to face the wolves again. And in that moment, Alexander felt the first true fracture, not in the contract, but in himself. He had wanted control, a simple arrangement. But now, facing a board ready to devour his wife, he realized something far more dangerous than scandal was at stake. His own loyalty, and whether he would stand by the woman he had sworn to dismiss. The war had begun, and Clara's dignity was the battlefield. Alexander could not ignore the storm any longer. The headlines, the whispers, the poisonous rumors had pierced deeper than he expected. But what shook him most was not the noise of the outside world. It was the memory of Clara's eyes when he had doubted her. There had been no defense, no pleading, only heard a quiet wound cut by the very man who should have shielded her. Late one night, he found himself in his study, pacing before the fire. The scattered articles lay across his desk, each line dripping with malice. And then, hidden beneath a fresh report from his private investigator, the truth surfaced. Receipts, bank transfers, all traced back to Victoria Hayes. She had orchestrated every rumor, every slander, to destroy Clara and reclaim her place at Alexander's side. The revelation struck him like a blade. He had accused the wrong person. He had let his walls blind him. And in doing so, he had betrayed the only woman who had stood with dignity when the world mocked her. The very next morning, Alexander acted. He arrived at the Parker Foundation's annual press conference, where dozens of cameras already buzzed, ready to feast on scandal. Clara had not been told he had asked his assistant to ensure she stayed home, safe from the chaos. When the microphones turned toward him, Alexander stood tall, his voice steady but edged with steel. "There have been lies," he declared, holding up the damning documents. "Lies about my wife, Clara Parker. Let it be known, she is not an opportunist, nor a pawn. She is the woman I chose, the woman who has shown more strength and integrity than anyone in this room. These rumors were planted by someone desperate to tarnish her. That person has been exposed, and they will face consequences." The room erupted with questions, but Alexander silenced them with a raised hand. "Understand this. Clara Parker is not merely my wife, by contract. She is my partner, my equal, and I will protect her with everything I have." The declaration hit the headlines within hours. The same papers that once mocked Clara now ran photos of Alexander's defiance, his hand raised in defense of his wife. For the first time, Clara's name was paired with words like dignity, resilience, and strength. When Alexander returned home that night, Clara was waiting in the foyer. Her eyes were wide, her hands clasped tightly together. "Why did you do that?" she whispered. He stepped closer, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Because I was wrong. Because you deserved more than silence. Because this is no longer about a contract, Clara. It never should have been." Her breath caught, her defenses wavering. For the first time since their signatures had bound them, she saw not the cold millionaire, but the man who had finally chosen her not for obligation, but for truth. And in that fragile moment, something unspoken passed between them. The walls of the contract cracked, making room for something real. The scandal unraveled quickly once the truth about Victoria Hayes came to light. The evidence Alexander had revealed was undeniable. Within days, her name became synonymous with deception, and she vanished from the glittering circles that once worshipped her. The board, relieved to see stability restored, shifted their focus back to business. The whispers about Clara faded, replaced by a quiet respect. Yet the real turning point was not in the newspapers or the boardroom. It came one evening, weeks later, inside the Parker estate. Clara had just returned from visiting her mother at the hospital. She found Alexander waiting in the grand foyer, not with his usual icy composure, but with a nervousness that seemed almost foreign to him. "I want to show you something," he said simply. He led her into the gallery wing of the mansion, a place she had never entered before. The walls, usually reserved for priceless art, had been transformed. Paintings and photographs filled the space, images of bookstores, of modest apartments, of women with quiet strength. In the center, beneath a wash of soft light, hung a framed contract, not the original one that bound them in cold ink, but a new page. Across it, in Alexander's bold handwriting, were words that made Clara's breath catch. "This is not a contract," it read. "This is my vow, to protect you, to respect you, to love you." Clara turned to him, her eyes wide. He stepped closer, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I entered this marriage as a prisoner of pride. I saw you as a burden, but you stood against ridicule, against lies, even against me. You proved yourself more than worthy, Clara. You proved me wrong, and I cannot let this remain just an arrangement. I want it to be real. I want you to be my wife, not by contract, but by choice." From his pocket, he drew a ring, not the cold band provided by the lawyers, but a new one. Simple yet elegant, chosen with care. He lowered himself to one knee, the powerful millionaire humbled before the woman he had once dismissed. "Clara Bennett Parker," he said, his voice firm but trembling with sincerity. "Will you marry me again, this time for love?" Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. She had endured humiliation, suspicion, and the crushing weight of survival. Yet in this moment, all of it seemed to fall away. She reached for his hand, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, Alexander. Yes, I will." The gallery echoed with the sound of applause, not from strangers, but from the household staff who had quietly gathered at the doorway, witnesses to a love that had bloomed from ashes. Their first wedding had been bound by duty. This second vow, spoken without contracts or conditions, bound them by choice. And as Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, both of them knew the truth. What began as a marriage of convenience had become the greatest twist of fate. A love neither of them had expected, but both of them would cherish for the rest of their lives.